The Banished are a mostly brute-led faction that was unintentionally created by the Covenant. They are known for their crimson color palettes and deadly ferocity. They are one of several Covenant splinter groups, but the Banished are very different from others of their ilk. These other groups, such as Julim Danla's Covenant in Halo 4, were formed after the Covenant fell. A power vacuum had to be filled. The Banished, however, they've been around since before the fall of the Covenant. Of course, there was other splinter groups that rebelled against the alien supergroup, such as Sessa Rufumi and his heretics from Halo 2, but the Banished are very unique in that, unlike Sessa, they remained too powerful for the Covenant to defeat. Their strength was unwavering, and despite the Covenant's many attempts to snuff them out, they rose in power and became a prominent force throughout the galaxy, even outliving the Covenant themselves. The Banished all started with one particularly intelligent Jiralhanae, or Brute. His name was Atriox. At the time, the Covenant were creating suicide squads of brutes, 40 individuals who were ordered into battles they couldn't win. Their only objective was to kill everyone. It didn't matter if the Covenant had a significant strategic advantage. It didn't matter if the Covenant had already won. They sent the brutes in anyways. No survivors on either side. The prophets orchestrating these attacks were completely and totally aware of the dangers of these particular missions, and frankly, they didn't care. Like many other lower-ranking individuals within the Covenant, these Jiralhanae were expendable. Much like the Ungoi or Grunts, the lives of these brutes didn't matter to the leadership of the Covenant. In fact, it was almost as if the Covenant wanted them to die. These groups of brutes would continuously be formed, and each would subsequently perish for religious beliefs of others, a belief that they often didn't share, until one survived. One returned from his battle, something his leaders never anticipated. This survivor was Atriox, but his survival wasn't commended or rewarded. Instead, Atriox and 39 other unfortunate brutes would be gathered for more of these suicide missions. When each battle came to a close, only one survivor remained, Atriox. With each assignment, each of his friends killed, his hatred for the Covenant grew, until it eventually overtook him. This didn't go unnoticed by some of the Covenant's leadership. A high-ranking elite and a prophet began conspiring against him. They never intended for Atriox or any of his fellow brute soldiers to survive. Their purpose was to kill as many humans as possible before dying in battle themselves. His continued survival worried the elite commander. The longer he lived, the more chances he had to question his leadership. He brought this concern to the attention of the Prophet, and with his blessing, the elite would have a talk with Atriox to determine whether or not he still had faith in the Great Journey, the Covenant's religion. Naturally, Atriox expressed discontent. He was tired of seeing his brothers killed in unnecessary battles. In the elite's mind, this was enough to consider Atriox a blasphemer and potentially dangerous to the Covenant. So he went to the Prophet again, and together, they both agreed Atriox was a problem that needed solving. Killing him outright wouldn't work. His comrades had far too much respect for him. He would become a martyr. But that didn't matter. The elite had the perfect plan to eliminate this threat. He assigned yet another task to Atriox and 39 more of his Jiralhanae kin. One of these brutes, however, was a religious zealot that very much believed in the promises of the Great Journey. This brute would watch Atriox carefully, and in so doing, witnessed him questioning his orders. Why was he killing these humans? What was the point? This blasphemous question was enough for this other brute to challenge Atriox. As you can probably guess, things didn't go over so well for this particular brute. Atriox made short work of him, but in so doing, he would be branded a traitor, and upon returning from his mission, sentenced to death. This was all a part of the elite's plan. Now he was a traitor, and therefore he had reason to kill him. The elite made Atriox get on his knees, and as he raised his energy sword to strike Atriox down, something within him finally snapped. He had had enough. He stopped the blade on its collision course with his flesh and turned it on his wielder, killing the Sangheili where he stood. This act of defiance inspired those around him, and with their help, he would kill this elite's entire squad. And with these newfound allies, he would form the Banished. With his brute companions by his side, he found new strength, and together they would become a group of efficient space pirates, raiding Covenant supply houses and stealing armaments, vehicles, and anything else they could get their hands on. They would even go as far as to recruit anyone willing to join their ragtag rebellion. Their numbers slowly grew. Unsurprisingly, the Covenant had earned the hatred of many. Atriox planned to rule the Banished very differently compared to the prophets and elites of the Covenant. He commanded his troops with logic and fairness instead of religious zealotry and fear tactics. He respected those who were willing to join him, and in so doing, he earned their respect as well. He had no prejudice towards any species in particular, allowing jackals, elites, hunters, and whoever else was willing to fight to join his organization, even humans. That's not to say that growing the Banished into the formidable force that we see in Halo Wars 2 and eventually Halo Infinite happened overnight. First, he'd need capable leadership aside from himself and his right-hand man, Decimus. Their first real attempt at conscripting an individual with actual power was a jackal by the name of Sigran. This clever Magyar had created a device that allowed her to control drone swarms as if she herself was one of their queens. Decimus believed that this device would prove valuable to the Banished and hoped to convince her to join their cause. He and several of his trusted Banished allies approached her stronghold, banking on her entrepreneurial nature. He figured she'd be willing to come to some kind of agreement. After all, the jackals cared not for the Covenant's so-called Great Journey. After a brief conversation, Sigran attacked Decimus and his forces, but unfortunately for Sig, Atriox had tagged along with his companion in secret, and with his help, they made quick work of the jackal and stole the drone control device. But before they could make use of it, Atriox snatched it up and crushed it in his gauntleted fist. Decimus was stunned. Why would Atriox destroy such a potentially useful tool? His reasoning was simple. Using a tool like this was everything the Banished was against. Those who joined his cause did so of their own volition. They joined because they believed in Atriox, not because they were forced to. Ultimately, that's why he and his allies left the Covenant, and Atriox saw the hypocrisy of making use of such a device. Atriox's next target was an elite shipmaster by the name of Let Valir. Atriox had gathered lots of intelligence on this Sangheli and had determined that Let was becoming disillusioned with the Covenant. He was questioning their leadership, something Atriox intended to exploit. He and his band of mercenaries were missing an integral tool, one they had not yet acquired during their conquest. They needed a warship, an assault carrier. They needed a flagship, and by convincing Let Valir to join them, they would acquire exactly that. Atriox's plan was simple. Infiltrate a Covenant base when Let Valir's ship was the closest, and therefore would be the first to respond to a raid. Of course, Atriox wasn't here for just supplies. He sought a much greater prize. A new ally. He knew the shipmaster would lead his forces onto the ground. He knew they'd be the first to respond. He would allow the elite to capture him, and then they'd talk. The Brutes certainly aren't the most charismatic culture, but Atriox knew exactly what to say to convince Let Valir to join his cause. He spoke of the elite's love for his brothers. He spoke of his growing distrust in the Covenant leadership. Atriox knew that all he cared about was the safety of his men and their future survival. So he offered him just that: provisions, fuel, the things they needed to survive. Except this time, they would receive these things without the religious zealotry of the Covenant looming over them. The elite and his forces wouldn't be sent on suicidal missions fulfilling religious beliefs not their own, not under Atriox's command. Ultimately, Let Valir agreed. Needless to say, the rest of the nearby Covenant fleet wouldn't take Let Valir's defection too kindly. They hailed his ship many times, and when they received no response, they assumed the worst. They believed the ship had been taken over by Atriox and his former crew had been killed. In a way, they were right. Atriox had taken over, but the crew was alive and well. The fleet dispatched a large contingent of Banshees and Seraph fighters to eliminate the ship. But what they didn't realize was Let Valir had a very interesting trick up his sleeve. He ordered his crew to prep for a pinpoint slip space jump, a jump that would only take them a very small distance, still well within view of the Covenant fleet. This jump would create a shock wave that would disable the systems within the fighter squadron's ships, and since they were still within range of a nearby planet's gravity well, they'd plummet to its surface, giving Let Valir plenty of space to make another slip space jump without any potential stragglers making their way through with him. His plan worked perfectly, and together, they escaped. Atriox's growing power would obviously attract attention from those that sought to steal it for themselves, or snuff it out entirely. After the fall of the Covenant, many different groups vied for power, and the name Atriox became legendary, as he had not only outlived the Covenant, but been quite the thorn in their side before their eventual end. One of the individuals seeking to fill the power vacuum left in the wake of the Covenant's fall was a brute warlord by the name of Jovis. Jovis was an old-school Geralhanai that believed in old customs and dated ideologies. He believed the Geralhanai had strayed too far from their ways. Before the days of the Covenant, warlords on his homeworld of Doisak would battle each other for power and respect. Much like the Sangheli in their sense of honor, he believed the only way to earn respect was to kill those who were in a similar situation to his own. Brute warlords didn't band together, but instead fought each other for respect. With no direction from the Covenant, Jovis had regressed to these old ways. He and his brute companions began fighting and raiding human settlements, simply for the fun of it. He reveled in battle and the defeat of his enemies. He wanted them all to know his name. He wanted them to fear him. His second in command was responsible for carrying his legend. Whenever they were about to win a battle, he and this other brute would gloat and brag about their victories. While raiding a human settlement, Jovis grabbed his commanding officer and began spouting his spiel of how legendary he was, how this human would just be another notch on Jovis's belt. But you see, these humans had never heard of him. They thought he was Atriox, and despite their defeat, they did not fear the name Jovis. No, they feared Atriox. This really bruised Jovis's ego. How dare these humans not know of his legend? The legend of Jovis. Well, I hate to break it to you, buddy, but I've never heard of you either, so I guess you're not so legendary after all. To Jovis, this was absolutely unacceptable. Surely he was more powerful than Atriox. Annoyed that the story of Atriox was far more feared and well-known than his own, he intended to remedy the situation by locating and defeating Atriox in combat. Then and only then would he be the most powerful Jiralhanae. He and his brute forces found Atriox fairly easily. He wasn't exactly laying low or trying to hide, especially considering the Covenant was no more. Jovis's men had gotten word that Atriox was actively raiding an old Covenant outpost, so he commanded his troops to leave at once. He would prove that he was the better fighter, the stronger warlord. When they arrived, Letvalir and his ship would be there to greet him. The elite made contact with Jovis, assuming they intended to join the ranks of the Banished. Jovis protested. He was here to talk with and fight Atriox, not some Sanghele lackey. Jovis ordered his men to make landfall on the planet where Atriox was raiding the ex-Covenant outpost. Letvalir allowed them to pass, knowing full well they'd meet their doom if they chose to engage Atriox in battle. Jovis landed in a large clearing and exited his ship where he came into contact with Decimus. He spoke to Jovis with respect. He had heard of him and, like Letvalir, extended an invitation to the Banished. Jovis was insulted that Atriox sent an underling in his place instead of coming himself. He ordered his men to spread out and search for Atriox while he aimed a spike rifle at Decimus. As his men fanned out, several explosions suddenly shook the ground. Jovis's forces had stepped onto a series of landmines that the Banished had hid underneath the first few layers of the planet's crust. The instant Jovis realized what was happening, gunfire poured out of the trees into his forces. By landing in the clearing, they had walked right into an ambush. Atriox had intended for them to arrive here, going as far as increasing the size of their LZ prior to their arrival. After a very brief skirmish, Jovis and his men were defeated, but many were kept alive, including Jovis himself, although he was greatly injured. As it turns out, one of the brutes within Jovis's pack, the very same brute responsible for facilitating Jovis's legend, had contacted Atriox before they arrived in hopes that they could join the Banished. That's how Atriox knew he was coming. That's how he knew to place mines and create a clearing before they made landfall. Wounded and defeated in battle, Atriox finally stepped before Jovis, and once again, offered him to join their cause. He didn't want to kill him. He knew he would make for a great ally, but Jovis was set in his ways. He was a stubborn old man. In his mind, Atriox couldn't be respected for allowing him to live, and because he was defeated, his men would never respect him again either. So he attacked Atriox one final time, forcing Atriox to kill him. Jovis's right-hand man was in absolute shock and disbelief. He wanted Jovis to join the Banished, and he thought that if they had been bested in combat, he would consider it. But Atriox knew better. He knew these old customs would never die within Jovis, unless Jovis himself was killed. Jovis wasn't the only individual seeking to kill Atriox. His infamy had put him on many other radars as well, such as Rise of Atriox, a member of a particularly deadly subset of elite soldiers called the Silent Shadow. The Silent Shadow were some of the Covenant's deadliest warriors and were typically only dispatched to eliminate very high-valued targets, like the Spartan 3 headhunters from Halo Evolutions, for example. Much like the Banished, they're known for their crimson armor and modified red energy swords, typically burning hotter than their standard blue counterparts. After the fall of the Covenant, Reza and 3 of his Silent Shadow brothers took it upon themselves to eliminate every Jiralhanae that they could find. He wanted them to pay because in his mind, they were responsible for the Great Schism, the beginning of the end for the Covenant when the Prophets tried to replace the elites with the brutes in Halo 2. Reza and his elites had killed many brutes prior to their next prize, even being responsible for the elimination of Tartarus's remaining men. Who are they after now? Take a wild guess. So Reza and his men did what they do best. They snuck aboard one of Atriox's ships, the Elegies Lament, and began methodically slaughtering his men. Thanks to their camo modules, the Jiralhanae that they killed simply stood no chance. But as I'm sure you've learned by now, Atriox is a little different than your average brute. Atriox was actually able to smell the elite's cloaking devices, so when they approached, he called out to them, letting them know he was fully aware of their presence. Reza and his cronies uncloaked and revealed themselves. At this point, I'm sure you can guess what happened next. Atriox spoke. Once again, he intended to reason with his foe. He'd rather they join his cause than be forced to kill them. Okay, hold up a second. Have you ever seen the older 80s horror anthology movie called Creepshow, written by Stephen King? Looking at these panels of Atriox, I can't help but think of the crate from Creepshow. I mean, look at those creepy teeth. I swear it looks just like Atriox. I will never unsee that. Sorry, anyways. Unfortunately, despite the logic behind Atriox's words, Reza's hatred towards the brutes was just too great. He couldn't listen to reason. He was clouded by vengeance. He came here to kill the brute, and he wasn't going to leave until his blood was spilled. His brothers, on the other hand, they were a bit more prosaic. They saw the beauty of the offer laid before them and tried to talk Reza out of his revenge quest, but he refused to listen. He prepared to attack Atriox, but before he could make a single swing, 3 red energy swords plunged through his back, killing him almost instantly. The Covenant was gone, the great journey a lie. Times had changed, and like Atriox, Race's men no longer believed in petty revenge quests. They'd much rather join the Banished and live to see another day. By now, the Banished had become quite the formidable force. Their numbers had grown exponentially, and Doisak as a whole had started to idolize Atriox. They were beginning to rally behind him, and soon he'd be a proper chieftain of the brutes, a chieftain with fresh ideas and uncaring of old ideologies. Eventually, Atriox would make his way to the Ark, though how he came to know its location or what he intended to do with it once he arrived is unknown. It's possible he acquired its location from a ship that had already been there, such as the Shadow of Intent, Artas Vadum's ship, or the Aegis Fate, the ship that can be seen in the sky of Sandtrap. Since the end of Halo 3, humanity had created several bases on the Ark. These bases were created in hopes of studying the strange construct. The portal from the Ark to Earth that we see in Halo 3 was still open, and humanity intended on using it. But without warning, this gateway mysteriously became inactive, trapping the human forces on the Ark, and shortly after, Atriox arrived. He absolutely decimated them, leaving only one known survivor, an AI by the name of Isabel. Meanwhile, the UNSC Spirit of Fire, Captain Cutter's ship from Halo Wars, was drifting through space. Its crew had been placed into cryosleep for an unknown duration as they had no functional slipspace drive and therefore no means to return home. Suddenly, the Spirit of Fire was transported through slipspace by an unknown force, most likely Mendicant Bias, one of the greatest Forerunner AIs ever created. Long before the Covenant and humanity dominated the stars, the Forerunners fought in an arduous war against the Flood. This AI, Mendicant Bias, turned against his Forerunner creators and aided the Flood in the Forerunners' destruction. Eventually, the Forerunners would create another AI as powerful as Mendicant, called Offensive, with the sole goal of defeating Mendicant. Offensive succeeded, and Mendicant was subsequently imprisoned and forced to contemplate his heinous actions for the rest of time. In this great span of meditation, Mendicant became penitent and felt true guilt for his actions. He only wished to aid humanity in an attempt to right his many wrongs, something he would eventually do by assisting Master Chief on several occasions. It's possible that Mendicant was responsible for transporting the Spirit of Fire to the Ark in an attempt to guide humanity into defeating Atriox, a rapidly growing threat in the galaxy. Despite the fact that the Spirit of Fire had no backup and was only at about half crew capacity, Captain James Cutter and his forces were able to hold their own against Atriox and his Banished, regardless of the overwhelming odds stacked against them. However, the first contact with Atriox didn't exactly go over well. Initially, a small group of Spartan 2s, Alice, Douglas, and Jerome, all of which who were part of the Spirit's crew, went to one of the Ark research outposts established by the UNSC. When they arrived, they found it in ruins, the only survivor being Isabel. She revealed herself to the Spartans in an attempt to warn them of the danger that Atriox posed, but it was too late. The hulking beast appeared and engaged the 3 Spartans in combat. Now, I know what you're thinking, 3 Spartan 2s versus one single brute? Surely Atriox was swiftly defeated, or at the very least injured. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case at all. Within a few brief moments, he had almost completely incapacitated Douglas, breaking his arm and crushing his helmet.
As I suspected. Nothing but a man.
But luckily for them, Atriox wanted them alive. He wanted them to retreat so that they'd lead him to where they came from. The Spartans successfully made their way back to the Spirit, but that also meant Atriox now knew of their presence, and he didn't intend to allow them to stick around. In the time before the Spirit of Fire arrived at the Ark, the Banished had taken control of the Ark's portal network, granting them the ability to teleport virtually anywhere on its surface. Knowing this, the Spirit of Fire's crew desperately attempted to take away their control of this gateway system. With the help of Isabel, they were able to not only prevent the Banished from further accessing these portals, but they were able to kill Decimus, Atriox's second in command. With this victory, their next goal, using a very bold and unique plan, was to destroy the Enduring Conviction, the Banished flagship piloted by Led Valir. Their strategy was insane. Jerome, the leader of Red Team, which is the group of Spartans I mentioned earlier, infiltrated the Enduring Conviction with Isabel in tow. He inserted her into the ship's systems, giving her control of the ship and its many weapon arrays. Using its glassing beams to blast the surface of the Ark with superheated plasma, she was able to destroy its surface and no doubt many integral mechanisms beneath it. This forced the Ark to engage in defensive measures, and an attack force of an incomprehensible quantity of aggressor sentinels used themselves as projectiles, flinging their bodies into the outer walls of the Banished flagship. Within moments, the sentinels had cut a clean line straight through every layer of the ship, severing a large portion and destroying it completely. In an attempt to call for backup and warn the rest of the UNSC of Atriox and his Banished, an integral scientist within the Spirit of Fire's crew devised a very clever, albeit insane plan. The Ark is on the outer edge of the Milky Way galaxy, therefore there was no way for them to make contact with any of the greater UNSC fleet. They were stranded and just too far out of range. Much like Cutter and his crew, Atriox was also unable to contact any additional Banished forces thanks to the destruction of the Enduring Conviction. They were both stuck and caught in a stalemate. Unless the scientist I mentioned, Professor Anders' plan worked. Anders figured out that the Ark kept a nearly finished Halo ring in its forges at all times in case one of them was destroyed. Her plan was to finish creating the ring and allow the Ark to transport it to its designated location. The only Halo ring that had been completely obliterated was Installation 04, the ring from Halo CE. This ring's assigned spot in space was near enough to reach, which meant it was within range of a UNSC comms beacon. Along with the ring, she'd send a message that would hopefully reach the UNSC and allow them to send out a warning. And maybe, if they were lucky, someone could return to help them. The Banished caught wind of this plan, and Atriox sent a large contingent of his forces to the surface of the newly formed ring. This way, they could contact the rest of the Banished fleet, and with their help, defeat the Spirit of Fire and take control of the Ark. Anders was seemingly getting better and better at taking control of Forerunner systems, though, and thanks to her skill and intelligence, she found a way to jettison entire land masses from the surface of the ring. With this newfound knowledge, she selected a continent-sized piece of the ring and flung it upward, sending the Banished forces on its surface into the harsh vacuum of space. She had no intention on staying on the surface of the ring as it entered the slipspace portal, but in order to defeat the Banished forces on the ring, she had to be on its surface. She couldn't extract before the ring entered slipspace, but as she and the ring entered the portal, she promised Cutter and his crew she'd get a message out to the UNSC. She'd get them some help. Unfortunately for the Spirit of Fire, this help never came, so Cutter did what he does best. He engaged the Banished wherever possible. He wasn't about to stop fighting, even if it seemed like they had nothing left to fight for. Sometime later, a pair of brute brothers, both high-ranking individuals within Atriox's army, were tasked with the mission of securing extra plunder and supplies to help them defeat the humans on the Ark. These brutes, Pavium and Voridus, were told that the Covenant had left tons of weapons and other treasures around High Charity when it crash-landed. According to Atriox, it was up to them to locate and collect whatever they could find. Unlike Pavium, Voridus was reckless and adventurous and decided that the loot within High Charity would be a far better prize, despite Atriox explicitly ordering him not to enter. He had heard rumors of ghosts and parasites within the walls of High Charity, but foolishly he brushed them off as mere Covenant lies. Though not an entirely unreasonable thought process, he couldn't be more wrong with his assertion. The leaders of the Covenant manufactured many lies, each typically designed to manipulate those living within their empire, but the tales of the problematic parasite called the Flood were all true. After fighting armies of Sentinels on their way to the exterior of the moon-sized construct, Voridus breached the outer walls of a large hard light barrier that had been placed around the ex-Covenant city. It was erected by the Ark's custodian, Tragic Solitude, in the time prior to the Banished occupation of the construct. He then ordered a group of brute warriors into the building. Almost immediately upon entering, the Flood revealed themselves, flinging infection forms onto the brutes, transforming their bodies, taking control of their nervous systems, and shambling out towards Voridus and his troops. A single, now Flood-controlled pawn hobbled before them.
He's just standing there, menacingly!
It let out a blood-curdling scream before hordes of new and dangerous Flood forms poured out and began attacking them. Pavium was furious at his brother for making such a ridiculous decision, and now, thanks to him, they had a huge problem on their hands. Not only had they unwittingly released the Flood, but if Atriox found out that Voridus disobeyed a direct order to not enter High Charity, he'd surely have their heads. Think about that for a second. They were more afraid of Atriox's wrath than the Flood. Either they're crazy or Atriox is just that badass. I'm inclined to believe it's a combination of both. In the time that the Flood had been festering in High Charity, they had cooked up all new horrors for the Geralhani to deal with. Thankfully, the Gravemind that we saw in the end of Halo 3 had been mostly destroyed by the activation of the partially complete Installation 08. This ring would have been a replacement for Installation 04, the ring featured in Halo CE. However, due to the ring's unfinished state, its activation was unable to purge all of the Flood located on the Ark. Some survived, and these survivors were angrier than ever. The Flood began coordinating quickly and on the move, creating all manner of new atrocities the likes of which had never been seen during any previous modern Halo-era Flood outbreak. It's possible that in their ancient wars against the Flood, the Forerunners contended with these new shambling shapes, but I can't say for certain. In no time, a proto-Gravemind was formed, and Pavium and Voridus banded together in an attempt to neutralize this growing threat. By now, Atriox had caught wind of the outbreak and was more than a little pissed. If it wasn't contained by the time he arrived at their location, they would suffer the consequences, something the Brute brothers feared more than the proto-Gravemind before them. They commanded all the troops they could muster, assaulting their atrocious, amorphous adversaries, even hurling themselves onto the front lines. After a desperate and hard-fought battle, the proto-Gravemind was destroyed, and just in the nick of time, too. Atriox arrived to survey the carnage. Fortunately, the Flood had been mostly contained, and because of this, Atriox didn't kill them, but he tasked Pavium and Voridus with thoroughly cleaning the Ark of this new filth and ensuring there was no flood survivors. What steps they took to purge any additional infection is unclear, but it's unlikely they were 100% successful. It's possible and likely that the Brute brothers are still working on their parasitic purge today. The New Halo Encyclopedia even makes mention of the Flood's continued survival, stating, "Its insidious presence is patiently waiting for an opportunity to emerge onto the galactic stage once again." The additional forces that weren't on the Ark had no way to rendezvous with Atriox until an old brute by the name of Escharum would help activate a slipspace portal hidden on Reach. This portal would allow Atriox to leave the Ark and command a much larger portion of his troops elsewhere, tasking several trusted allies to take command of the Banished troops that were fighting the Spirit of Fire. With Decimus gone, Atriox appointed Escharum as his new second-in-command, and should Atriox die in battle, he would continue to lead the Banished in his name. Together, they would launch a surprise attack on the UNSC Infinity. Thanks to the threat of Cortana, Infinity's resources were somewhat drained, and communications with other UNSC ships was cut off. Because of this, they were caught almost completely unaware when the Banished arrived to attack them. They quickly and decisively destroyed the Infinity, or at the very least left it greatly injured. Atriox himself would lead the initial charge onto the ship, encountering and defeating the Master Chief, flinging him into space where his armor would put him into a sort of suspended animation for 6 months. A survivor of the Banished Infinity altercation, by the code name of Echo 216, stumbled upon the Chief as he drifted through space, purely by happenstance. Fortunately for the Chief, Echo 216 was able to retrieve him and restore functionality to his suit. The two of them would then set off to the surface of Zeta Halo, one of the 7 Forerunner Ringworld weapons, in an attempt to regroup with any survivors and prevent complete Banished control of the ring. I've got plenty more videos in the works, so subscribe and click that bell icon, that way you don't miss them. Thanks so much for watching. Please consider liking this video, sharing it, and checking out some of my other stuff. Okay, now if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go play some Halo.